Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first place city. In these recent episodes, we've been talking about the evolution of utility services in this area, and we began way back in Spanish times talking about how people worked with wells and privies, and how gradually in the latter part of the 1800s we began to have a private water system and then city sewers. We visited with the evolution here, the beginnings of manufactured gas for street lights. We brought in the story, of course, of the beginning of the telephone company and the beginning of electric service. And then, of course, when we moved into the 20th century, we had the city buy out the private water system. And then in 1926, Gulf Power Company coming in here and succeeding the Pensacola Electric Company, and so on as our story evolved. We left off at the end of World War II with the beginnings in Escambia County of more and more subdivisions. Now, subdivisions were remote areas. They were not within the easy scope of the city utilities. Gulf Power could serve them, but they were outside the scope also of gas. And we need to go back and pick up one thread that, of course, did not begin in the 1800s, but came to us here in the 1930s. It was at this point in time that the Armstrong Cork Company had been on stream for several years, and early in their history, their process had called for drying their product with steam-driven hot air. And that was a not too satisfactory arrangement. So with a lot of politicking and so forth, beginning in the early 1930s, the United Gas Pipeline Company began a service out of Texas into this area. They came primarily to serve Armstrong, but very quickly a private company was spun off so that the natural gas could now be piped into homes and businesses as well. And that service, of course, was a cardinal part, because ultimately this service would be acquired by the Gulf Power Company, and then Gulf Power was pressured by state regulatory agencies to not have two different utility organizations under one tent, and so they in turn, the Gulf Power in turn, did sell the service off to the city of Pensacola, and it became what is known in the 21st century as ESP, the gas service. Well, as we moved into the 50s now, and more of these small subdivisions are coming into being, they are using, number one, septic tanks, and then number two, some of them begin to take a further step and begin creation of their own sewage treatment plant. This was basically, in most cases, a primary service plant. Did reasonably good work, but the problem was, as you add this subdivision and this subdivision and this subdivision, the outflow from these sewage treatment plants began to become an environmental factor. Pollution was a word that was just then beginning to seep into the public lexicon here. People were beginning to get worried about it. This was particularly so of the health department, and step by step this happened. And by the time we reached the year 1960, this whole problem was emerging, because people said what we've got to do is find a way to bring the outflow from many of these sewage treatment plants into one place and have it one large plant that will really do a better job, not just primary, but a higher level of sewage treatment. And so at this point in time, the city council got together. And I want to mention just a couple of names, because this became a very controversial thing after a time. But bear in mind, the city council at that time included such men as Charles Overman, who was a very quality civil engineer, Vince Wibbs, Reinhard Holm, Roger McDonald, Ralph Merrill of Gulf Power Company, Charles Soule, who was also a fine engineer, Pierre Brown, who was a certified public accountant, Kenneth Kelson, who for many years was on the city council and the county commission both. These men put their ideas together, and the system that was planned now was basically relied a lot on gravity. They were going to bring the outflow from many of these little suburban plants down toward Pensacola, and they were going to build one new sewage treatment plant. Now, remember, we talked about in a prior episode that two plants had been built here. The first two sewage treatment plants had been built in the mid-1930s, one at the foot of 9th Avenue, the other at the foot of DeViller Street, and these had continued to operate now into the early 1960s. They were operating all right, but they were still not quality operations. is. And as a result of this, now the grand plan was build one major plant at the foot of DeViller Street that would take care of city needs and many of those from the county. And so what became known as the Main Street Sewage Treatment Plant was erected and was operational about the end of 1964. Well, of course, many people who live in this area will remember the story that this almost from the beginning created new problems because they had great difficulty. In fact, they never did overcome entirely the problem of odors from that plant. And also, within just a couple of years, by the end of the 1960s and early into the 1970s, the federal Congress had responded to what we would today call environmental campaigns, that might be the right word, to do something about not only clean water, but also clean air across our country. People said we are destroying our planet because we are not taking care of it. And so in the early 1970s, two very important bits of legislation were passed. These were the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. And our congressman at that time, Bob Sykes, was very aware of how important the cleanliness of the waters was to this area here. And Mr. Sykes was very much involved with this, and he became a kind of a companion worker along with the local Home Builders Association, because the home builders recognized how important it was to be able to provide utility services to future construction that they might have anywhere in the county. So the whole campaign began, and early in the 1970s, we had a major campaign here to improve what we were doing, and step by step they did this. Well, as this occurred, people began to say, well, we just are not, there are more subdivisions being built. We can't hitch them all to the downtown plant. We've got to do something. And people began to turn to the county and say, well, look, county commissioners, you have got to do something to pull all of this together into a single authority and to make someone who could literally legislate this and then provide adequate supervision. The county worked on it. The city worked on it. There was a time when the Chamber of Commerce was urging that the city and county begin to work together. And by the time we reached the latter part of the 1970s, it was apparent that that was going to happen. And so after very lengthy negotiations, a new organization was created. And basically, it went like this. The city and the county were both going to sell what they owned as water and sewer operations. The cities, of course, within city limits, the counties, a collection of sewage treatment plants and water systems that they had acquired outside city limits. And this became known as the Escambia County Utility Authority. Now, basically, what was going to happen was a new authority was created, and they sold, that authority was enabled by state legislative act to sell bonds, which in turn would pay the city and the county for the operations which they were giving then or placing into this new utility authority. And that happened. The city, all of the basic structural costs were met that way, and the city was, in addition, the city was paid $10 million to cover what the legislators called loss of future income, which the city would have derived from the water and sewer operation, because that had been a money source for the city for a number of years. And so the utility authority was created. Among the early people who were placed on that authority, number one was a man named Harold Rose, who had been the president of Newport Industries and had sat on the city council for some years. Harold Rose was I think I can honestly call him a financial genius. He understood money, and he knew how important it was to regulate what was being done here to be sure that all of the people being served by this new system were treated fairly. The second man from the city council was Lou Brown, who had been a councilman for many years and also very able in this sort of thing. From the county commission came Kenneth Kelson, who had been a city councilman, now was a county commissioner, and these men were among others who were placed on the original authority. Now, what happened, of course, men and women who had been part of the city utilities operation were transferred to the utility authority. People who had been county utility workers were moved into that same authority. And it would be easy to see why problems arose, because these operations were separate. They had not done things the same way, and they did have problems to begin with. The billing problem was the greatest one, because they were beginning to apply computers to this, but the system that had been set up to take care of these thousands and thousands of accounts each month just was not adequate, and that caused great problems. And of course, the public relations effect of this was not good. But in addition to that, the monies that had been spent to improve the Main Street sewage treatment plant had still not done the job that people wanted. That plant still had the unpleasant effect of odors, and people said, "Well, this is blight. This is creating a blight downtown. We can't expand the economic area along the waterfront as long as we've got a sewage treatment plant there." And the others said, "Well, maybe we ought to start planning for putting the operation somewhere else." And as the operation grew over the next 4 to 5 years, the utility authority recognized that there needed to be a second major plant. And so they created one on the west side of the mid-county, which became known as the Marcus Point sewage treatment plant. And that was put in place and was doing a very good job. The two plants operated interchangeably in an emergency situation. Well, things were moving along slowly but surely toward a different resolution, and then came to Hurricane Ivan on the 16th of September in 2004. Well, the morning after the terrible storm, the downtown sewage treatment plant was literally surrounded by water. It had suspended operations very briefly. Electric service had been cut off. People were afraid, and when after the post-storm evaluations were made, people realized how fortunate we had been in this community, that there had not been even more damage done and more problems affecting the community itself and its health. So now the force was in place. We have to move the sewage treatment plant. Over the next year, we had stories about the federal operation from FEMA. We had people from the City Council, from the County Commission, from the Chamber of Commerce. Everyone was pushing toward a resolution. And finally, beginning after about 2 years, the plan began to take form. One of the great problems, of course, was how are we going to pay for all this? And give credit, if you will, to the members of the board of the utility authority and to the authority's managers. They did a superb job of working ahead, coming up with a new master plan, which would literally create a new sewage treatment center about 15 to 18 miles north of the city of Pensacola, up just a little to the south of where the Solutia plant, or the Ascend plant as it's now called, was to be operated. In addition to that, the plan that they put in place was to benefit both St. Regis Paper Company and International Paper Company and Gulf Power Company in the use of flow from these operations, because in the long run, by careful use of the outflow from the sewage treatment plant, we would find much less water drawn on a daily basis out of the sand and gravel aquifer, and of course this would benefit everyone. So basically, paying for the operation was in part by monies from FEMA, from a modest amount from the county, some from the city, and then a large bank loan that was put together that involved several local financial organizations. There would be a small additional charge per month for all users, and that's the way that the operation succeeded. And into the early years of the next decade, of the first decade of the county of the century, this work was proceeding ahead of schedule and under budget. And as all of this, of course, was taking place, the benefits to the community were great, because now downtown sewage treatment plant would be gone, and that area would be available for economic development. And now the whole center of the county would have available to it services, water and sewer services that had not been there before. So as we approach the end of the first decade of the 21st century, that was where things stood. Our electric service was in excellent condition. Telephone services, of course, were changing radically with the revolution in that form of service. And so basically we can say that as we talk to you in this episode today, we have proceeded with the evolution of utilities from almost nothing to, well, certainly a new era for the entire area.